Hey everyone, Elliot here from Prismata, and today I'm going to be talking about that guy right there, the Redeemer, which is one of the more interesting Prismata units, especially in the sort of story surrounding how it has been repeatedly changed and modified. And in fact, the unit is almost 5 years old. We've been playing with variations of this unit ever since we first started messing around with the game that would eventually become Prismata. So today I'm going to take you through a little bit of the history of Redeemer and what we've learned along the way while trying to design such a weird and strange unit. So what is Redeemer? Well, Redeemer right now is a unit that when you buy it, you get this pretty strong attacker. Right now it's a 3/4. It used to be even bigger than that. And immediately after you buy it, your opponent gets a benefit. So there's a drawback to you of your opponent gets a bunch of Gauss charges or something like that, so some damage you have to absorb. And in fact, the first version of Redeemer, it didn't give your opponent Gauss charges. What it actually did is gave your opponent the ability to freeze all of your stuff the turn after you bought the Redeemer. And in fact, freeze everything was one of the abilities in Prismata at the time, and so the Redeemer gave your opponent this freeze everything ability, which is kind of insane. But anyway, so I've written down here the stats of, at least in my records, the first ever version of this unit that I could find. It's horrifically undercosted, imbalanced, broken, as you might imagine. But also keep in mind that like Conduit was actually more expensive back then, so it might not be as bad as you think. But anyways, it was a 6/6 legendary unit, meaning supply 1. And it caused your opponent to be able to freeze all your stuff. So what you would often do is you would like rush to get out this unit, which was originally called Rook. It wasn't called Redeemer. And you would rush to see if you could construct it before your opponent. And if you did, you would often just win. And so it, we realized it was too strong. Throughout sort of the first, I guess, couple of months of playing with it, we realized it was busted. The unit became known as Ice Princess or Rook Ice Princess, and through a number of nerfs, we gradually increased the cost of the ability, which we dubbed Ice Awakening. This was back when Prismata wasn't a sci-fi game; it was more of a fantasy game. So it was, there were different themes mishmashed everywhere. But anyways. And so it got nerfed and nerfed and nerfed to the point where sort of the rush to who could construct it first was a bit more interesting because there was more tech involved, and oftentimes you'd want to buy other things, and you could like get your own while countering the opponents. But the problem is then all of your stuff would be frozen, and your opponent would have 6 damage to attack you while you had no defenses, and you, on the other hand, wouldn't have your Rook in time for the opponent's stuff to get frozen. So it still strongly favored whoever got it first in a mirror, and in a non-mirror it was maybe nerfed enough to be kind of balanced, but usually still like pretty good. Anyways, so those versions were very, very broken, and eventually I'd say around 2012 we got rid of this Ice Awakening because we realized it was just completely degenerate. And we replaced it with your opponent gets damage, right? So you would buy the Rook, and then your opponent would get 6 Gauss charges or something like that. Of course, they weren't called Gauss charges back then either. And this was certainly a better version of the unit in terms of being less completely and utterly broken. It still had this property of being this one big monolithic powerful unit that you would often want to rush to, and in particular you'd want to set up defense and then get it, and it sort of just played like a giant version of some of the more recent Redeemers that you guys have been seeing lately. So that was 2012. 2013 was when we made it a small unit. So it used to be a 1 supply legendary. It was huge. It was a 6/6. I think through a series of small changes, we tried making it a bit smaller, and then we decided let's just make it a lot smaller, because the problem with the unit must be that it's just too big, so that the swing when you get it is too large. So let's try making it smaller, because we liked this idea of a unit that you would try and rush out early and sort of plan your defense around. It contributed a variety of gameplay that didn't really exist in other units. So we liked the overall concept, but we just felt that we were implementing it wrong. So we changed both the power and the cost. So it was brought down. I think we probably messed around with a few different costs. We eventually settled on triple green and blue after a bunch of testing. And I guess 2014 was when we sort of finalized all that. We gave it that name Redeemer. We got its art commissioned after it was decided it would be a blue-green unit. And then we released it this year in February. And so the first version that you guys got to play with, if you were in the alpha back in February, was 8 green, green, blue, and it was a 3/4, and it gave your opponent 4 Gauss charges immediately after you bought it. And so that didn't actually last long. In April, we nerfed it, I guess. Well, we modified the cost from 8 green, green, blue to 7 3 greens and a blue. So changing 1 gold into 1 green, which is in most cases a nerf. And that was mostly just to weaken the unit a little bit in the face of certain openings that seemed really scary powerful. And so Redeemer actually stayed like that for a while. I think for most of the summer of this year, that was what Redeemer was. And we were relatively happy with it, although there were some folks who thought that the openings were a little sharp, maybe a little crazy sometimes. And what we did is we looked at a bunch of stats surrounding the unit to try and figure out whether or not it was balanced or whether or not the unit kind of was working as we intended. And what we found was actually it was kind of busted. Player 2 win rates in Redeemer sets were like too high. I think they were above 54%, which is at the point where we start considering that we should probably make a change. And also, we had released Thunderhead, and people were finding that Redeemer plus Thunderhead was a bit of a combo to the point where it was scary good sometimes. So we tried changing Redeemer again. And, throughout the years of experience with this unit, the one thing that we kept coming back to was the idea of your opponent getting a giant burst of damage all at once when you bought the thing. Well, it has the effect of, if you want to balance Redeemer so that it's, say, like a decent purchase in the middle game or the late game, you have to balance it in a way such that in the early game, if you're able to deal with that damage boost that your opponent gets and mitigate it effectively, then Redeemer becomes so overwhelmingly strong. Because it's just so much better in that early game strong situation than it is in the later game when you're sort of playing more standard. So the thought that we had was maybe we can smooth out the damage and have it dealt over more turns so that the difference between Redeemer's value in the early game versus the late game was smaller. And then we could find a cost for it that was a bit more aggressive so that Redeemer saw more purchases in the late game, while simultaneously being less sharp and edgy in the early game. And so we experimented a bunch. We tried this 2-2-2 Redeemer. Originally on our test server it was 7 and 2 greens and a blue, and we played with that, found it to be a little weak, changed it to 6, played with that, thought it was still maybe a little weak, and changed it to 5. And this was after a bunch of internal testing. And as it turned out, the 5 double green and a blue Redeemer, it was released on a Friday or something, and everybody said, "This seems so broken. This is ridiculous." And I think we removed it around like the Monday after or something. People just completely destroyed the unit over the course of 3 days, finding all kinds of broken ways to abuse its low cost with really crazy early builds. And sometimes that happens when you're running an alpha of a game, right? We have some internal playtest groups containing a lot of strong players. I was playing with a few of the sort of top-ranked players on the ladder, and playing with Will, and Will was playing with other players, and so on, other folks on the dev team, our Luminary group. And, after playing a certain number of games with a unit, at some point we decide, okay, let her rip, let's go on the alpha server and see how folks on the alpha do with it. And oftentimes we expect that something may get broken, that there's some chance that somebody will find a problem. I think this was released around the same time as changes to units like Grenade Mech and a few other units, and I was just thinking, well, they might break something. Probably one unit in the last patch will get broken because we changed about 15 things, and we're okay with that. We're able to make changes. Folks in Prismata, I always say this, but folks in Prismata don't physically own the cards, so we don't have to feel bad about buffing or nerfing things because we're not affecting anybody's collection. So, it was taken away like 3 days later, and we decided, okay, we'll go back to the drawing board, and we basically released a very similar unit that was just a whole lot weaker. So it was a 1 gold nerf, and because it was still too strong, as in like player 2 auto win with Xeno Guardian plus Redeemer, we decided we also needed to change the 2/2/2 to a 3/3. Because 2/2/2 was actually like still too strong. So 3/3 is sort of moving some of the damage a bit sooner to when you bought the Redeemer actually weakens it. So we did that, and we let it percolate for a while, and that's sort of the current Redeemer that was around for the last couple of weeks. And then ZZTel posted this amazing article on Evan's Prismata.xyz page called Thunder-Deemer. And it outlined a very specific player 2 build that you can do when you have Thunderhead and Redeemer. And it goes like this. You open as player 2, you go Drone Conduit, and then on your next turn you go Conduit and store 4, so you don't buy anything else. Turn after that you go Blast Forge, store 7, don't buy anything else. Turn after that you have exactly 15 gold, 5 green and a blue, and so you buy a Thunderhead. And then off of that Thunderhead you get maybe 2 to 3 Redeemers, and use your Thunderhead to soak up the damage from the Gauss charges they generate from the opponent. And that specific opening proved to be so powerful that in many sets involving Thunderhead and Redeemer, it was just player 2 auto win. Like, there was absolutely no way for player 1 to do anything to counter the build, and believe us, we tried. We looked into it quite a lot. And there were some threads that seemed to offer player 1 a little bit of hope, and if you looked a bit deeper into them, it seems pretty much that player 1 just gets stomped, or at the very least has to play a very specific line to even have a chance in the game, which is certainly not where we want the balance of the units in our openings. So Thunder-Deemer did it in, we had to let it go, and we've been thinking internally, and I've mentioned this on some of the streams, what is our backup plan if none of these Redeemers end up working, right? Is there something that we'll be able to do to guarantee that Redeemer isn't going to cause any problems? And the answer is yes, we do have a backup plan. The backup plan is to release a Redeemer that doesn't give your opponent any Gauss charges right away, but instead gives all of the Gauss charges a turn or 2 later than the current Redeemer. So instead of like a 2/2/2 Redeemer or a 3/3 Redeemer, something like a 0/0/5 Redeemer is what we had in mind, and we've actually been testing it. And it has a couple of effects. First of all, the combo with units like Thunderhead is a lot weaker because you only really get value out of buying the Redeemer on the turn such that the Gauss charges arrive for your opponent when the Thunderhead's about to die. So if you could sync that up, you could still get some value, similarly with Chieftain. But it's not so overwhelmingly powerful that you get Thunderhead by, cutting 5 drones and then just spamming Redeemer as hard as you can as soon as you possibly can. So that's one effect. It also changes the value of Redeemer with respect to the sort of way the game is flowing. In fact, in the opening, Redeemer is still a little bit strong because the sort of inflation rate in Prismata is high, and therefore the value you get from having an early attacker is greater relative to the value your opponent gets by having those Gauss charges. So it changes that up a bit, and towards the end of the game, Redeemer also can become good in those situations where you just need damage right now and want to breach your opponent, and if the game's going to be over in 2 turns, then you don't even care if they get a bunch of Gauss charges in 3 turns, right? So that aspect of the unit is a bit different, and also you don't have to worry as much about getting value out of it early by like having walls up in time, and your opponent, if they don't have early attackers, doesn't lose a whole lot of value by having the Gauss charges just absorbed by your walls. So that aspect of the unit is quite changed, and we like it a lot better, and it seems a lot more balanced, and it just eliminates all of the problems associated with the old Redeemer. And it still does have a little bit of the aspect of planning your build order around getting out an early Redeemer or getting defense so that you can defend against the Gauss charges in time, but instead now you have a bit more time to worry about getting the defense, so it's less extreme than the old version. Seems all around a bit more flattened out. So that is our plan of what we're going to try. And I think after the latest balance changes, we're looking at 9 green, green, blue for a 3-4 Redeemer that has 0, 0, 5. And that may change. We are going to launch it tomorrow on the alpha server, so you guys will get a chance to play with it. And we're reasonably confident that it's not completely broken. But as usual, if you guys find anything, we'll be making further changes. So I guess that's it. That is the history of Redeemer and all the iterations that it's gone through, all the different things that we have tried over the years, all the changes that we've made as we've sort of learned more about how the unit actually plays. And, you know, just looking back at the original Rook and how completely and utterly insane it was, and sort of just really broken and really misunderstood by us as developers, and sort of how far we've come in what is now almost 5 years. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed that little talk about Redeemer. And if you have any suggestions about the unit, comments, or anything, please send them to us. You know, any balance suggestions, we literally read everything that you send, and we consider it all when we're looking toward further balance patches. So thanks for your support during the alpha, and I look forward to seeing you on the ladder.